My boss demoted me, I became his client's only investor. The morning everything changed started like every other morning, but something felt off and Ethan Cole could feel it before anything even happened, because when you work in a place long enough you learn to read the air before the words are spoken, and that morning the air was heavy. Ethan sat at his desk staring at his screen filled with reports, projections and performance charts, and like always everything was perfect because Ethan was known as the one who delivers in a company full of noise. He was the result, the quiet engine behind the company's growth, the kind of employee every business claims to want but secretly fears when he becomes too good and too visible, because being an underestimated genius only works until people start noticing you, and when they do things begin to change slowly, and then suddenly his inbox refreshed and a new email appeared. Subject: mandatory department meeting 10 a.m. No explanation, no context, just a command. Ethan leaned back slightly, reading it twice because meetings like that don't happen without a reason, and reasons in corporate environments are rarely good. Across the office, Sophie Grant looked at him and raised an eyebrow. She had seen the email too. Ethan nodded once and closed the message. Something's coming, he thought, and not the good kind. The clock moved slowly until 10 a.m. and when Ethan walked into the conference room he immediately saw Richard Hale standing at the front, dressed perfectly as always, calm, controlled, smiling that same empty smile Ethan had come to understand over the years. Richard Hale was the kind of boss who talked about leadership but practiced control, the kind who praised loyalty but feared competition, and Ethan, without trying, had become competition. Without ever asking for power, he had earned influence through performance, and that was enough to make someone like Richard uncomfortable. Ethan took his seat beside Sophie. The room filled quickly and the tension became almost visible. Richard started speaking about numbers, growth projections, success metrics. Everything looked strong, actually stronger than ever, but something was missing: Ethan's name, because even though everyone in that room knew who made those numbers possible, Richard avoided giving him credit completely. And then he stopped walking and stood still, looking directly at Ethan, and that was when the shift happened. This company demands adaptability, loyalty and respect for leadership, Richard said slowly, and the tone had changed. It wasn't a speech anymore. It was a setup. Ethan remained still, calm, focused. He had learned not to react too quickly, especially in rooms like this. Ethan Cole has shown impressive technical ability, Richard continued, and for a second it sounded like recognition, but Ethan already knew better, because in corporate politics compliments often come right before damage, but performance alone is not enough, Richard added, and the room went silent, the kind of silence that feels like something is about to break, and then it happened. Effective immediately, Ethan will be stepping down from his current role. The words landed heavy and cold, and before anyone could process it fully, Richard continued, due to concerns regarding alignment with leadership, he will be reassigned to a junior support position. Sophie turned instantly in shock. Others looked at each other confused. Daniel from HR lowered his eyes because even he knew this wasn't right, but no one spoke, because in environments like this people protect their positions first and truth second. Ethan sat still, not because he wasn't affected, but because he understood something important. Reacting emotionally in moments like this only gives power to the person creating the situation, and Richard wanted a reaction. He wanted to see Ethan break to justify the decision, but Ethan didn't give him that. Instead he spoke calmly. Can you clarify the concerns? Richard smiled slightly, that same cold, controlled smile. This isn't the place for debate, Ethan, which really meant you don't get to defend yourself. Sophie tried to speak, but Richard shut it down immediately. The decision is final, and just like that, years of performance were erased, publicly downgraded in seconds, and everyone in the room knew it wasn't about work, it was about control and fear, because nothing scares a weak leader more than a strong performer. Ethan slowly stood up, and the room watched, expecting anger, frustration, something, but Ethan simply adjusted his jacket, looked directly at Richard and said, I understand. And that moment confused everyone, because it looked like acceptance, but it wasn't. It was calculation, because what looked like a fall to everyone else was actually the beginning of a shift. Ethan walked out of the room calmly as whispers filled the air, people questioning the decision, wondering what really happened, but Ethan ignored all of it because his mind had already moved forward. He understood now this wasn't workplace betrayal by accident, this was a calculated move to remove him from visibility, to limit his access to important decisions, to isolate him, and that only meant one thing: there was something bigger happening, something Richard didn't want him to see. Sophie caught up to him in the hallway, clearly upset. This is insane, you need to fight this, she said. Ethan stopped and looked at her, not angry, not broken, just clear. I will, he said quietly. Sophie frowned. Then why didn't you say anything in there? Ethan gave a slight smile. Because this isn't where the real decisions are made, and that Was the truth real? Power doesn't sit in meeting rooms, it moves quietly behind them. Later that day, Ethan sat at his new desk, smaller, placed at the edge of the office, a visible demotion designed to send a message to everyone else: stay in line or this happens to you. People walked past him, some avoiding eye contact, others offering silent sympathy, but Ethan didn't care about perception anymore because something had shifted inside him. He opened his laptop not to review his new tasks but to review something else: client data, specifically Victor Langford's account, one of the biggest accounts in the company and the one Richard personally managed. Ethan began scanning through the numbers carefully, patterns, trends, decisions, and then he noticed something off. At first it looked small, a minor inconsistency, but as he kept going it became clear this wasn't one mistake, it was a pattern of bad decisions, risky moves, approvals that didn't align with the company's strategy, and every single one of them traced back to Richard Hale. Ethan leaned back, slowly connecting everything in his mind, and then it became clear the demotion wasn't random, it wasn't about alignment, it was about removal. Richard didn't want Ethan near this account because Ethan would have seen it, and once he saw it he would have questioned it, and once he questioned it everything would have started to fall apart. This was never about performance, this was about hiding something, and now Ethan had seen it clearly, and that changed everything, because now this wasn't just a story about a boss demoted me situation, this was the beginning of a corporate revenge story, a real one built on intelligence, strategy and timing, not emotion, not anger, but calculated movement. Ethan looked around the office again, everything felt different now, the same people, the same desks, but the perspective had changed. He wasn't the employee anymore, not in his mind, he was something else already, shifting into a different role, one that no one in that building expected. And that's the thing about being underestimated, people only see what you were, never what you're becoming, and that is where power grows, quietly, without attention, without resistance. Ethan closed his laptop slowly, and for the first time that day he smiled, not because of what happened but because of what he now understood. Richard thought he had won, he thought removing Ethan from position removed his influence, but what he actually did was remove the only person who could have protected him from what was coming, because now Ethan was free from internal rules, free from hierarchy, free to think differently and act differently, and that's where the real transformation begins, the kind that turns an employee into something far more dangerous, someone who doesn't need permission anymore. And as Ethan walked out of the office that evening, the city lights reflecting across the glass buildings, he realized something simple but powerful: this was not the end, this was the start of a journey from employee to investor, from being controlled to controlling outcomes, from being ignored to becoming unavoidable. And somewhere out there Victor Langford had no idea that the person who would soon become his only investor, the one who would change everything, had just been demoted that morning. And if you're watching this right now and you can already feel where this story is going, make sure you subscribe, like and follow, because this revenge success story is only getting started, and what happens next will completely change the game, because the biggest mistake Richard Hale ever made was thinking Ethan Cole had nowhere else to go, when in reality he had just stepped into a much bigger world, and this time Ethan wasn't playing to survive, he was playing to win. The next morning didn't feel like a new day, it felt like a continuation of something unfinished, and Ethan Cole walked into the office with a different mindset, not as a demoted employee but as someone who had seen behind the curtain, because once you understand that a workplace betrayal is not random, you stop reacting and start observing, and that is where real power begins. His new desk was still in the corner, quiet, almost invisible, but that invisibility gave him something he never had before: freedom to watch without being watched. People moved around him as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. Ethan opened his laptop calmly and returned to the one thing that now mattered: Victor Langford's account, because the more he looked, the more the story revealed itself, piece by piece, decision by decision, and what looked like poor management on the surface was actually something deeper, something dangerous. This wasn't just miscalculation, this was control, manipulation and short-term thinking disguised as leadership. Richard Hale had been making aggressive moves, cutting costs where stability was needed, pushing strategies that looked good on paper but weakened long-term value, and the worst part was Victor trusted him completely, which meant the fall wouldn't just hurt the company, it would destroy the client as well. And that was when Ethan understood this was bigger than a boss demoted me situation, this was a system failure waiting to collapse, and he had just been removed from the one position that could have stopped it. Sophie Grant approached him quietly, placing a coffee on his desk. "You didn't have to come in today," she said softly. Ethan looked at her and gave a small nod. "I needed to see something," he replied. Sophie crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "You're not letting this go, are you?" Ethan didn't answer immediately, because the truth was more complex than that. It wasn't about holding on to anger, it was about recognizing opportunity hidden inside unfair situations. People think revenge success story moments come from emotional reactions, but the truth is they come from patience and timing, and Ethan was already thinking 3 steps ahead. This isn't about them anymore, he finally said. Sophie frowned. Then what is it about? Ethan turned his screen slightly, showing her a section of the client report. These numbers don't make sense, he said. Sophie leaned closer, scanning quickly, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. What am I looking at exactly? She asked. Ethan spoke calmly. Richard has been restructuring Victor Langford's business model, but he's doing it wrong. He's cutting foundational support to create artificial profit spikes. It looks impressive short term, but long term it's unstable. Sophie blinked. Wait, are you saying this is going to fail? Ethan nodded. Not just fail, collapse. And when it does, it won't just affect Victor, it will hit the company hard because this is their biggest account. Sophie stepped back slightly, absorbing everything. Then why would Richard do that? Ethan leaned back, thinking because he needs quick wins, something to show the board, something that keeps his position secure. Short-term success over long-term stability. It's a common mistake, but in this case it's more than a mistake, it's a risk. Sophie shook her head slowly. And they removed the one person who could see this. Ethan didn't respond because that was the truth, and both of them knew it. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was heavy with realization. This wasn't just a demotion, it was a strategic removal, and now Ethan had to decide what to do with that knowledge, because knowing something and acting on it are 2 different things entirely, and this was the moment where most people would either walk away or try to fight from inside the system. But Ethan was already thinking differently. He had spent years building expertise, understanding patterns, reading decisions, and now for the first time he was outside the structure that limited him, and that meant he could move in ways he couldn't before. Later that day, Ethan requested access to archived data, something small, something that wouldn't raise suspicion. Daniel Cross approved it without much thought, because on paper Ethan was just doing support work now, nothing threatening, nothing important, and that assumption was exactly what gave Ethan his advantage, because being underestimated is the most powerful position when you know how to use it. Ethan spent hours digging deeper, tracing financial flows, analyzing decision timelines, comparing projections to actual outcomes, and what he found confirmed everything. The business wasn't just unstable, it was being pushed toward a breaking point. Intentionally or not, the result would be the same. Victor Langford's company would face a crisis, and when that happened they would need help, real help, not the kind Richard was offering. And that was when a new idea formed clearly and sharply in Ethan's mind. What if he didn't try to fix this from inside? What if he positioned himself outside, ready to step in at the exact moment everything collapsed? Because that's how power shifts really happen, not by force but by timing, not by confrontation but by positioning. And suddenly the entire situation looked different. This wasn't a loss, this was an opening, a path from employee comeback to something bigger, something no one in that building would expect. As the day ended, Ethan packed his things slowly, his movements calm, deliberate, because now every step mattered. Every decision needed to align with a larger strategy, and as he walked out of the building he didn't look back, not because he didn't care but because he had already moved forward mentally. The city felt different that evening, louder, brighter, full of movement and possibility. Ethan stood for a moment watching the flow of people, each one focused on their own direction, and he realized something important. Most people move within systems they don't question, but the ones who step outside those systems are the ones who change outcomes. And Ethan was no longer thinking like an employee, he was thinking like someone preparing to build leverage, preparing to create opportunity where others only saw failure. That night he sat in his apartment reviewing everything again, but this time not as analysis, as strategy, because information without action is useless, and he wasn't interested in knowing, he was interested in doing. He opened a blank document and began outlining possibilities, paths, connections, potential moves, and one name stood out clearly: Victor Langford, because at the center of everything was a man who didn't even realize he was walking toward collapse, and that made him vulnerable, not weak but exposed, and exposure creates opportunity for those who can see it. Ethan leaned back, looking at the plan forming in front of him, and for the first time since the demotion he felt something different, not frustration, not anger, but control, the kind of control that comes from understanding the full picture, from seeing what others miss and knowing exactly when to act. This was no longer about proving Richard wrong, this was about building something bigger, something independent, something that would shift the balance completely, because in a true business revenge story the goal isn't to destroy the other person directly, it's to rise so high that their influence becomes irrelevant, and Ethan was already on that path. The next morning the office buzzed with normal, routine conversations, emails, meetings, everything moving as if nothing had changed. But beneath that surface a quiet shift had begun, because Ethan Cole was no longer part of the system in the way they believed he was. Now he was something else, something they didn't see coming, someone preparing to move from being controlled to becoming the one who controls outcomes. And somewhere across the city Victor Langford continued his business, unaware that the strategies guiding him were leading toward failure, unaware that the one person who could save him had just been pushed out of the very company he trusted. And if you're following this story right now, you can already see the setup forming, you can feel the shift coming. This is where a simple workplace betrayal transforms into a powerful corporate revenge story, where an underestimated employee begins the journey toward becoming the only investor who matters. So stay with this story, because what happens next will take everything to another level, and the truth behind the hidden decisions will start to unfold in ways no one expected. The moment Ethan Cole stopped thinking like a demoted employee was the moment everything began to change, because the truth about every powerful revenge success story is simple. It does not begin with anger, it begins with clarity, and Ethan had reached that point fully and completely. He no longer cared about proving Richard Hale wrong inside the company, because he had already seen something bigger, something that most people never get the chance to see, an opening hidden inside a workplace betrayal. An opening that could transform him from an overlooked employee into something far more powerful. And that shift did not happen overnight, but it started quietly. The very next day, Ethan woke up earlier than usual, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. When your direction changes, your discipline changes too, and Ethan understood that if he was going to move from employee comeback to investor level thinking, then every part of his routine had to reflect that. He sat at his desk at home with his laptop open, not reviewing company tasks, not responding to internal emails, but studying markets, business models, investment patterns, and risk structures, because for the first time he wasn't preparing to execute someone else's vision, he was preparing to build his own. And that difference changes everything. He started with something simple: understanding how investors actually think, because being good at work and being powerful in business are two completely different things. One follows instructions, the other creates outcomes. Ethan read case studies, watched interviews, analyzed failed companies and successful turnarounds, and one pattern kept appearing again and again. The biggest opportunities are always hidden inside instability, not in perfect systems, not in smooth growth, but in moments where something is about to break, and most people run from those moments while a few step toward them. And that is exactly where Ethan now stood, because Victor Langford's business was not stable. It was moving toward collapse slowly but clearly, and that meant opportunity, not for everyone but for someone who understood timing. Ethan leaned back in his chair, thinking through everything he had seen in the data, the mistakes Richard was making, the pressure building inside Victor's company, the inevitable breaking point that was coming. And for the first time, he didn't see it as a problem, he saw it as a door. And that is what separated him now from the version of himself that sat in that conference room days ago. That version reacted, this version positioned himself. Later that week, Ethan took his first real step outside the company. He reached out to Olivia Reed, someone he had only met briefly at a business networking event months ago. At the time, she was just a name, a contact, nothing more, but now she represented something valuable: access to a different world, a world of capital, strategy and influence. Olivia was known for her sharp thinking and her ability to identify high-risk, high-reward opportunities, and Ethan knew if he wanted to accelerate his transformation, he needed to learn from someone like her. The message he sent was simple, clear and confident. No emotion, no explanation, just intention. Olivia responded faster than he expected, which told him something immediately. She was curious, and curiosity in people like her usually means opportunity. They met in a quiet modern cafe in the city, the kind of place where serious conversations happen without noise. Olivia arrived exactly on time, sharp, composed, observant. She studied Ethan for a moment before speaking. "You don't reach out without a reason," she said directly. Ethan nodded, because she was right. People operating at her level value clarity over politeness. "I need perspective," he said simply. Olivia raised an eyebrow on what Ethan paused for a second, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted to say it the right way. "On moving from execution to ownership." Olivia leaned back slightly, now interested. "That's a big shift," she said. "Most people never make it." Ethan met her gaze calmly. "I'm not most people." Olivia smiled slightly, and that was the moment the conversation changed, because confidence, when it's real, not forced, not loud but steady, has a way of opening doors that skill alone cannot. She asked him questions about his background, his experience, his understanding of business structures, and Ethan answered clearly, not trying to impress, just stating facts, showing patterns, explaining how he sees problems and, more importantly, how he sees solutions. And as the conversation continued, Olivia began to see what others in the company had missed or ignored. Ethan was not just a performer, he was a strategist, someone who had been operating below his level because of the environment he was placed in. And when that kind of person steps outside that environment, things begin to shift quickly. "So what's the real situation?" she asked finally. Ethan didn't hesitate. "A company is being mismanaged at a high level. Decisions are being made for short-term gains that will lead to long-term collapse." Olivia nodded slowly. "That's not uncommon. Where do you fit in that?" Ethan Answered calmly, I used to be inside, now I'm outside. Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly, now fully engaged. And what do you want? Ethan leaned forward slightly, not aggressively but with focus. I want to be in position when it breaks. Olivia didn't respond immediately, and that silence meant she was thinking, calculating, measuring risk and potential, and after a moment she spoke. Then you're not looking for a job, you're looking for leverage. Ethan nodded. Exactly, and that word changed everything, because leverage is what separates employees from investors. It's what turns knowledge into power and timing into opportunity. Olivia studied him one more time before speaking again. Then you need to stop thinking like someone who lost something and start thinking like someone who is about to gain everything. Ethan didn't react outwardly, but internally that statement locked something into place, because it confirmed what he already felt. This was not a setback. This was a setup from that point forward. Everything accelerated. Olivia began guiding Ethan through key concepts: how to structure deals, how to identify entry points, how to measure risk without fear, and most importantly, how to act when others hesitate, because hesitation is where opportunities disappear. They met multiple times over the next few days, each conversation sharper, more focused, building on the last, and Ethan absorbed everything quickly because he wasn't starting from zero. He already had the foundation, he just needed direction. And that direction was now clear. Meanwhile, inside the company, things continued as normal, at least on the surface. Richard Hale presented strong reports, numbers that looked impressive, growth that seemed stable, but beneath that surface the cracks were forming, exactly as Ethan predicted. Victor Langford's company was starting to feel the pressure: operational strain, financial imbalance, internal confusion, but no one was addressing it correctly because the strategy guiding them was flawed, and the person who could have corrected it was no longer in the room. And that was where the real shift was happening, because while Richard believed he had removed a threat, he had actually removed the only person who understood the full system, and now that person was no longer restricted by company boundaries. Ethan stood one evening looking out over the city again, but this time his thoughts were different, not reactive, not uncertain, but precise. He knew what was coming. He knew where the weakness was, and more importantly, he knew when to move. This was no longer just a corporate revenge story. This was a transformation, a movement from being controlled to controlling outcomes, from being part of the system to influencing it from the outside. And the most powerful part of it all was that no one saw it coming, because in every underestimated genius story, the moment of transformation is invisible until it's too late. And somewhere in the middle of all this, Victor Langford sat in his office reviewing reports, trusting the strategy placed in front of him, unaware that the foundation beneath him was already shifting, unaware that the person who would soon become his only investor was not someone new, not someone introduced through a formal process, but someone who had been there all along, someone who understood his business better than anyone else, someone who had been pushed out at the exact moment that would allow him to return with far more power. And as Ethan turned away from the window and picked up his phone, preparing for the next step, he understood something clearly now. This journey was no longer about proving anything to anyone. It was about building something undeniable, something that would place him in a position where he was not asking for opportunity but choosing it. And if you're following this story right now, you can feel the shift. You can see how a simple "boss demoted me" moment has turned into a powerful employee comeback, into a strategic path toward becoming a dominant investor. This is where everything begins to connect, and what comes next will take this revenge success story to another level, because the moment Victor Langford realizes what is happening will be the moment everything changes, and Ethan Cole will be ready, not as an employee, not as a victim, but as the one person holding the solution. And in that moment the power will finally shift completely. The difference between people who watch opportunities pass and those who take control of them is timing, and Ethan Cole had reached the moment where timing was no longer something to wait for but something to act on, because everything he had predicted was now unfolding exactly as expected. And when a plan aligns with reality, that is where power becomes real. Victor Langford's company was no longer stable. The cracks that Ethan had seen earlier had widened into visible pressure, missed targets rising, costs, internal confusion, and quiet panic among senior staff. And the most dangerous part of all of it was that the strategy meant to fix things was making it worse. Richard Hale continued pushing aggressive short-term moves, trying to maintain the appearance of success, but every decision was draining the foundation faster. And now the situation had reached a point where something had to give, and Ethan knew this was the exact moment he had been preparing for, because in every true corporate revenge story there comes a point where preparation meets opportunity, and the ones who move at that exact point are the ones who change everything. Ethan sat across from Olivia Reed in the same quiet cafe, but this time the energy was different, sharper, more focused, because now they were no longer discussing possibilities, they were discussing action. "It's happening," Ethan said calmly. Olivia nodded. "I can see that from the market signals. The pressure is visible now. The question is, are you ready?" Ethan didn't Hesitate. I didn't come this far to hesitate. Olivia leaned forward slightly. Then let's be clear, this is the point where most people fail, not because they don't have the opportunity but because they doubt themselves at the moment they need to act the most. Ethan held her gaze steady. I'm not most people. Olivia gave a small approving nod. Then you move now before anyone else sees the full picture, because once it becomes obvious the opportunity disappears, and just like that the decision was made, not emotionally, not impulsively, but strategically, because this was not just about a boss demoted me situation anymore. This was about stepping fully into a new identity, one where Ethan was no longer reacting to events but shaping them, and the first step in that move was simple, direct and powerful. He needed to reach Victor Langford, not through the company, not through formal channels, but directly, because power does not move through crowded paths, it moves through precise connections. Later that day, Ethan stood outside a modern office building where Victor's company was based. The structure looked strong from the outside, clean glass, sharp lines, everything suggesting stability and success, but Ethan knew better because he had seen the inside of the numbers, and numbers don't lie even when people do. He walked in calmly, not as an employee, not as someone seeking permission, but as someone with purpose, and that difference showed in the way he carried himself. Confidence, without arrogance, clarity. Without hesitation he approached reception and asked for a meeting, not demanding, not desperate, just certain his name was enough, because even though he had been removed from the company, his work had not been forgotten, and in business results leave a longer memory than titles. After a short wait he was escorted to a private office where Victor Langford sat reviewing documents. Victor looked up, slightly surprised to see him. Ethan Cole, I didn't expect to see you here, he said. Ethan nodded calmly. I figured it was time we had a direct conversation. Victor leaned back, studying him carefully, because something about Ethan's presence was different. No longer the quiet employee, no longer the background strategist. There was something sharper now, something controlled and confident. This should be interesting, Victor said. Go ahead. Ethan didn't rush, because timing even within conversations matters. I'm not here as a representative of the company, he said clearly. I'm here because I understand what's happening inside your business better than the people currently advising you. Victor's expression changed slightly, not defensive but alert. That's a strong statement. Ethan nodded. And it's accurate. What you're experiencing right now isn't random, it's the result of strategic decisions that prioritize short-term appearance over long-term stability. Victor leaned forward, now fully engaged. Continue. Ethan spoke calmly, laying out exactly what he had seen, the patterns, the decisions, the risks building beneath the surface. He didn't exaggerate, he didn't dramatize, he simply presented the truth clearly and precisely. And as he spoke, Victor's expression shifted from curiosity to realization, because deep down he had already felt something was wrong, he just hadn't been able to see it fully until now. So what are you saying? Victor asked finally. Ethan met his gaze directly. I'm saying that if nothing changes, your business will reach a breaking point soon, and when it does, the damage will be difficult to recover from. The room went quiet for a moment, not tense but heavy with understanding, because truth, when it is clear, cannot be ignored easily. Victor exhaled slowly, and for the first time he looked uncertain, not weak but aware, and that awareness was exactly what Ethan needed, because opportunity only opens when someone is ready to see reality. What's your angle? Victor asked finally, because men at his level understand that information always comes with intention. Ethan didn't avoid the question. Because clarity builds trust. My angle is simple, I have a solution. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of solution? Ethan leaned forward, slightly controlled, focused. I'm prepared to invest in your company, not as a passive observer but as a strategic partner, someone who understands where things are failing and how to rebuild them properly. Victor studied him carefully, because this was not a small offer, this was a shift in direction, a move away from existing structures and relationships, and decisions like that are never taken lightly. You're asking me to walk away from my current advisors, Victor said. Ethan shook his head slightly. I'm asking you to look at results, not titles, because in the end that's what determines outcomes. Victor leaned back again, silent, thinking, processing, weighing risk against potential. And this was the moment that defines every major business decision, not the numbers, not the presentations, but the instinct, the ability to recognize who understands the situation best. And Ethan had positioned himself perfectly, not as someone desperate for opportunity but as someone offering control in the middle of chaos, and that is the most powerful position anyone can hold. You're confident, Victor said finally. Ethan responded without hesitation. Yes. Victor nodded slowly. Then show me. Ethan didn't waste time. He opened his laptop and began outlining a clear strategy, not complicated, not overloaded with unnecessary detail, but focused, precise, actionable steps to stabilize restructure and rebuild the business from its current state, and as Victor listened the difference became clear. This was not the same thinking he had been receiving. This was deeper, more grounded, more aligned with long-term success, and that was when the shift began, because the moment someone sees a better path clearly, the old path starts to lose its hold. The meeting continued longer than expected, because when conversations are real, time becomes irrelevant, and by the end of it Victor had not made a final decision, but something more important had happened. He had started to question everything he had been told before, and once doubt enters a system built on trust, that system begins to weaken. As Ethan stood to leave, Victor spoke again. "If what you're saying is right, then this changes everything." Ethan paused slightly and looked back. "It already has," he said calmly, and with that he walked out, not pushing, not forcing, because he understood something important: the strongest decisions are not rushed. They are realized, and Victor was already moving in that direction. Outside the building, Ethan took a slow breath, not out of relief but out of awareness, because he knew this was only the beginning, the first move in a much larger shift. And inside another building across the city, Richard Hale continued presenting reports, unaware that the ground beneath him was starting to move, unaware that the employee he had demoted was now sitting at the table that mattered most. And that is how real power shifts happen, quietly, without announcement, without warning, and by the time it becomes visible it is already too late to stop it. And if you're following this story right now, you can see how everything has come together, from a simple workplace betrayal to a calculated employee comeback to a powerful investor move. This is where the revenge success story reaches its turning point, because the next decision Victor makes will not just affect his company, it will redefine the balance of power completely, and Ethan Cole will be at the center of it, not as someone asking for a second chance, but as the only investor with the vision to rebuild everything. And in that moment the meaning of being underestimated will finally become clear, because the ones people overlook are often the ones who change the game entirely. Everything changed the moment Victor Langford made his decision, and the most powerful thing about it was that it did not happen loudly. It did not come with announcements or dramatic exits. It happened quietly, with clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes when someone finally sees the truth. And once that happens, there is no going back, because illusions lose their power the second reality becomes visible. And that was exactly where Victor now stood. He sat alone in his office late that evening, reviewing everything Ethan Cole had shown him, every number, every pattern, every risk, every possibility, and for the first time in weeks, maybe even months, everything made sense. The pressure he had been feeling was not random, it was the direct result of decisions that were never designed for long-term success, and the man he trusted to guide those decisions, Richard Hale, was not protecting his business, he was slowly weakening it. And that realization hit hard, not emotionally but strategically, because men at Victor's level understand one thing clearly: business is not about comfort, it is about survival and control. And in that moment he knew that if he continued on the current path he would lose both. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan sat quietly, not waiting, anxiously, not checking his phone every second, because he understood something most people don't. Once you present the truth clearly, the decision becomes inevitable. You don't chase it, you let it come, and that patience is what separates those who react from those who lead. And then it happened. His phone buzzed once, a simple message from Victor Langford: "We need to move forward." No extra words, no hesitation, just confirmation. And that single message marked the turning point of everything, because in that moment the story shifted completely, from a boss demoted me situation to a full corporate revenge story driven by intelligence, timing, and execution. Ethan looked at the message for a second, then placed his phone down calmly, not celebrating, not reacting outwardly, because this was not the end, this was the beginning of the outcome he had been building toward. The next few days moved fast but with precision. Victor acted quietly, cutting back direct reliance on Richard's strategies, initiating internal reviews, restructuring decision channels, and most importantly opening the door for Ethan to step in, not as an employee, not as a consultant, but as the one thing that changes everything: an investor. Because in business the person who controls the capital controls the direction, and that was the position Ethan had moved himself into, not by force but by understanding where and when to act. Olivia Reed worked alongside him behind the scenes, helping structure the deal, ensuring that everything was solid, protected, and aligned, because a real revenge success story is not about quick wins, it is about building something that lasts, something that cannot be easily undone. And as the agreement took shape, it became clear this was not just a simple investment, this was a complete shift in control. Ethan would become the only investor willing to stabilize Victor's company, the only one with both the insight and the strategy to rebuild it properly, and that made him not just valuable but essential. And the moment someone becomes essential, their influence becomes unavoidable. Inside Richard Hale's office everything still looked stable on the surface. Reports were being
Delivered meetings were being held, numbers were still being presented in ways that looked acceptable, but something was changing slowly at first, then more clearly. Victor was no longer responding the same way. Decisions that once moved quickly were now being questioned. Approvals that were once automatic were now delayed, and for someone like Richard that kind of shift does not go unnoticed, because control, when it starts slipping, creates pressure. And pressure creates mistakes. Richard called for a meeting, expecting to reassert authority, to regain control, to remind everyone of his position, but this time the room felt different. The confidence he once projected did not land the same way, because people sense shifts before they are announced, and this shift was already happening behind the scenes. Victor joined the meeting remotely, calm, composed, but no longer passive. Richard began presenting his usual strategy, outlining plans, pushing forward the same approach that had brought them to this point. But before he could finish, Victor interrupted him for the first time. Richard paused, slightly surprised. "Yes," Victor spoke calmly, "we're changing direction." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Richard frowned slightly. "I'm not sure I understand." Victor didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't explain unnecessarily. "I've reviewed the current strategy and it's no longer aligned with where the company needs to go." "Effective immediately. We will be restructuring our approach and bringing in new investment." Richard felt something shift internally, not panic yet, but something close. "New investment," he repeated carefully. Victor nodded yes, "and with that investment comes new strategic leadership." The room went quiet because everyone understood what that meant even before the name was spoken. Richard's control was being replaced, and then it happened, the moment that defined everything. "Ethan Cole will be leading the restructuring process," Victor said calmly, and just like that the power shift became visible, no longer hidden, no longer building quietly, but fully revealed. Richard stared at the screen for a second, as if trying to process what he had just heard. Ethan Cole, the same person he had demoted, the same person he had removed from visibility, was now returning, not as an employee, not as someone beneath him, but as the person holding the future of the account. And that is the moment where true payback happens, not through confrontation, not through anger, but through position, because nothing is more powerful than becoming the solution to a problem created by someone who underestimated you. Richard tried to respond, tried to regain control, but the structure had already changed. The authority he once held was no longer absolute. The influence he relied on had shifted, and in that moment he realized something too late. He had not removed a threat, he had created one. The meeting ended without resolution because there was nothing left to argue. The decision had already been made, and as the days continued, the impact became clear. Victor's company officially reduced ties with Richard's firm, restructuring contracts, redirecting strategy, and placing full trust in Ethan's leadership. And just like that, the biggest account Richard had was gone, not through loss but through replacement, replaced by the very person he had tried to diminish. And that is how a true business revenge story unfolds, not with noise but with results inside the company. The reaction was immediate: confusion, shock, disbelief. People who once avoided Ethan now spoke his name with respect. People who once stayed silent now questioned decisions more openly, because power, when it shifts, changes behavior instantly. And Ethan remained the same, calm, focused, controlled, because his goal was never to prove something to them. His goal was to build something beyond them. Weeks later, the transformation was undeniable. Victor's company stabilized, operations improved, confidence returned, and the strategy Ethan implemented began producing real sustainable results, not artificial growth, not temporary success, but strong, measurable progress. And that is what separated him from everything that came before. He wasn't chasing numbers, he was building value, and that difference is what turned him from an employee into a true investor, into someone whose presence changes outcomes entirely. And then came the final moment, the moment every revenge success story builds toward. Richard Hale requested a meeting, not formal, not structured, but personal. Because when power shifts completely, people try to reconnect, to reclaim something, anything. Ethan agreed to meet, not out of obligation but out of clarity. The meeting was simple, quiet, direct. Richard looked different, not broken, but no longer in control. The confidence he once carried was replaced with something else, something closer to realization. "I didn't expect things to turn out like this," Richard said finally. Ethan sat across from him, calm as always. "Outcomes reflect decisions," he replied. Richard exhaled slowly. "You could have handled this differently." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "In what way?" Richard paused, then said, "You could have stayed, worked through it." Ethan gave a small, almost unreadable smile. "I did work through it, just not the way you expected." And that was the truth, because while Richard believed the game was limited to the company, Ethan had stepped outside that boundary completely and changed the entire playing field. Richard looked at him carefully, as if seeing him clearly for the first time, and in that moment he understood something that cannot be undone. He had underestimated the wrong person. "I made a mistake," Richard said quietly. Ethan nodded, not out of arrogance but out of simple acknowledgement. "Yes, you did," and that was it. No anger, no raised voices, no need for more, because the outcome spoke louder than any words ever could. Ethan stood up calmly and adjusted his jacket the same way he did on the day he was demoted, but this time the meaning was completely different. This time it was not the end of something, it was the confirmation of everything he had become. "You didn't just demote me," Ethan said calmly, "you redirected me," and with it he walked away, leaving behind not just a conversation but an entire chapter of his life that had already been replaced by something greater. And as he stepped outside into the city once again, the same city that watched him fall, now witnessing his rise, he understood something clearly. This was never about revenge in the way people imagine. It was about growth, transformation and positioning, turning a moment of being underestimated into a permanent shift in power. And if you've been following this story from the beginning, you can now see how everything connects, how a simple workplace betrayal turned into a powerful employee comeback, how a boss demoted me moment became a journey into becoming the only investor who mattered. This is what happens when intelligence meets timing, when patience meets opportunity, and when someone refuses to stay in the position others try to place them in. And if this story inspired you, if you felt the power of this transformation, then make sure you subscribe, like, share and comment, because stories like this are not just entertainment, they are reminders that being underestimated is not a weakness, it is an advantage if you know how to use it. And Ethan Cole used it to change everything completely.